39. A synthesis study on agro-biodiversity conservation. What is a synthesis study? There's a principle that I've learned early in life. You have to solve problems at a level commensurate with the size and complexity of the challenge. To put it another way, for you to be impactful in creating strategic space, you must have a sound understanding of what you are going up against. Although I did not initiate the challenge to study agro-biodiversity conservation, I was motivated to do so based on that lesson. Poverty reduction exercise was at the level of the sub-region, the OECS. That caused me to seek the same level of effort in explaining how the conservation of agro-biodiversity at the level of small farms could be a strong pro-poor policy plan. A synthesis study on agro-biodiversity conservation sounds like something that should excite a biologist or a nature scientist. So why should I be doing this study? It is all caught up in the idea of a synthesis study. Synthesis means to combine a number of different pieces into a whole so they can be further analyzed for hidden lessons. In a synthesis study, you are linking different aspects of the literature into an understandable content. You are making recommendations and you are connecting your practice to the research and vice versa, the research to your practice. My strong point in doing this study was not in the biological sciences. It came from my ability to frame the application of scientific knowledge within the spectrum of small farm options. The framework was not the biological knowledge of farming. It was the structural knowledge of building resilience in small farms by providing them with a new range of options for success. By this time, there were almost unanimous consensus on the major challenges to building resilience at the level of the Caribbean small farm production. These were as follows. Adequate attention must be given to the multifunctional and multi-sectoral nature of agriculture and its inextricable link to climate variability and change. Serious coverage of plant genetic resource policy and in particular agro-biodiversity in the context of food and nutrition security. Policy measures must sufficiently treat with the conservation, sharing, and utilization of genetic biological resources, particularly with the risks and benefits arising therefrom in the Caribbean. And we must create a credible support mechanism for policy analysis, processes, and implementation regional climate change mitigation in agricultural policies. The conservation of biological diversity. The idea for this study came from the Technical Center for Agriculture and Rural Cooperation, CTA, which was based in Wageningen in the Netherlands. This institution had connections to 80 developing countries, helping to improve the productivity and resilience among some of the world's most vulnerable rural communities. CTA supported small farm technological advances as the backbone of a global agenda for poverty reduction and economic growth. The organization's programs were tied to the Cotonou Agreement between the EU and the ACP, that is the African, Caribbean and Pacific Group of States, which provided the legal and financial framework for CTA. This framework agreement came to an end in December 2020, and so did the CTA. The basic intention was to have a consultant make a critical analysis of the key role that agro-biodiversity can play in the context of climate change impact and the application of such scientific knowledge within the Caribbean region. They wanted a policy analyst who understood the science and who could make the recommendations of how to facilitate agro-biodiversity conservation in the agricultural sector. CTA, however, was not seeking to spend its money on advancing the career of an academic professional. The final condition of this engagement was that the complete documentation of the above should be presented to a workshop plenary for discussion on the applicability of this approach. This was not a new challenge to me. I already had a head start in such endeavors when I organized my seminar in Kenya with the Directors of Agricultural Research in East Africa. There, I had already explained how to design an internal information system that would propel research findings into a quick adaptation by the farming community. I concluded this study by proposing 12 guiding principles for biodiversity conservation policy in agriculture. These were: conserve biodiversity wherever it may occur as an insurance against future biodiversity loss in a changing world. Conserve protected areas and other high-quality sites as their characteristics will continue to favor high biodiversity. Conserve the full range and ecological variability of habitats and species so as to maximize adaptation potential. Use all sources of harm that are driving biodiversity loss wherever possible. Conserve and enhance local variation in vegetation structure and in the physical environment. Make space for the natural development of rivers and coasts. Establish ecological networks at different scales through habitat protection, restoration, and creation. Adopt an evidence-based approach to the application of specific actions, for example, climate change adaptation. Respond to changing conservation priorities to ensure resources are directed effectively. Integrate adaptation and mitigation measures into conservation management planning and practice. Establish need on the basis of functional connectivity and not the simpler structural connectivity. Don't create requirements that are bureaucratic and costly. Took this route because it was necessary to present decision makers with something upon which they can reach agreement so as to increase the chances of possible action. Caribbean Agricultural Week. It so happened that the CTA was one of the prime sponsors of an annual event called the Caribbean Week of Agriculture, CWA. This was the premier event on the regional agricultural calendar. It provided a forum for key regional decision makers in the public and private sectors to acknowledge the importance of agriculture and rural life to the economic, social, and environmental stability of CARICOM member states. As a follow-up to its partnership with CARD, the CTA requested that my special synthesis study of agro-biodiversity conservation be presented to the CWA conference scheduled for Antigua in 2012. The invitation to do so came from Norman Gibson of the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute, CARDI. I didn't have any great expectation that these ideas would be picked up immediately by the agricultural research community assembled in Antigua for the annual CWA. Actually, even though the CTA was financing this CWA, I nearly didn't even get to speak. The conference had gone through 2 days of persons presenting their research works, which was sort of boring to me. Then, even though I was listed as the last speaker at the plenary, after the end of the speaker before me, the facilitator, sensing an unease in the audience, called for a break before we reassemble into workshop sessions. I turned to Norman Gibson, who was not only responsible for the project arrangements with CTA, also for financing my presence in Antigua, and made a signal to ask, "What's going on here?" He quickly ran to the facilitator, who later became another good friend of mine, and told him that I was scheduled to speak. It was a weird scene. Here was the coordinator, Steve Maxime, trying to halt the premature dissolution of the plenary by announcing that we still had one more speaker. You could imagine the skepticism with which that was received, which caused me to make my contribution very short and to the point. I had just one point to add to the body of knowledge that had been offloaded so far. It was that my study of on-farm biodiversity conservation simply reinforced the perception that farmers were important custodians of agro-biodiversity, and that their local knowledge was an irreplaceable element of agro-biodiversity conservation. This brought me to the critical question of how effective can your scientific research speak to common farming practices. Agricultural research had to span two vastly different farming worlds. There was the world of high input cost enterprises, where productivity gains depended on high-yielding seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. Then there was the other world of the low input cost agriculture, mostly rain-fed, where it is the diversity of crops and diversification of management strategies that gave them insurance against weather, climate, and market risks. Where is the vision of hope? How will your research transform Caribbean agriculture into a system that is climate smart, knowledge driven, pro-poor, and one that is positioned to reap the benefits of indigenous research and development? Options-rich agriculture. The challenge I posed to these young agricultural scientists was to demonstrate that your science is capable of speaking with an impact to common agricultural practices. I thought I would be bold and announce that I had been sitting quietly listening for 2 days, and frankly I was not impressed. Sometimes being an upstart does pay off. Persons began to settle back in their seats, and the questions started coming with full force. Was I fully versed with the inertia that exists in the area of agricultural policy in the region? These officials do nothing with our research findings. Well, these persons did not know me nor my background. It was not unexpected that they would assume that at best I may have spent some time reading about agricultural policy. They had no idea that I had been spending most of my time trying to rewrite agricultural policy. I responded by saying, if policy inertia was your problem, then I would give you two concepts to overcome that. There were foreseeability and the precautionary principle. Say what? I had been reading a scholar by the name of Michael Glantz. He had noted, much to my delight, a deficiency in the English language that made the interpretation of the words surprise and unexpected synonymous. You know how fascinated I can become with word order and word meaning. If you know or have some knowledge of the impact of an action, then it is foreseeable, and as such, you cannot claim its impact to be unexpected. The fact that you are ill prepared to deal with the situation may be evidence of a surprise, but not evidence of it being unexpected. Let us get this clear. Unexpectedness is a matter of timing, not a matter of occurrence. Furthermore, once you accept a condition as being foreseeable, you have to accept that the condition is also preventable. These folks had knowledge of all sorts of things that were foreseeable, and yet they were not taking preventable action even though they knew how to act. The approach using principles. The foreseeability principle is actually a legal concept relating to personal injury. In the law of negligence, the foreseeability aspect of proximate cause, that is the primary cause of an injury, is established by proving that the actor, whether he be a minister or director of agriculture, is assumed to be a person of ordinary intelligence and circumspection. That puts him in the category of one who should reasonably have foreseen that his or her negligence would imperil others. I'm not sure that the significance of this was truly understood at that time. 9 years later, in 2019 to be precise, we began to see citizens taking legal action to sue their governments for negligence based on the principle of foreseeability. In Indonesia, a group of 32 plaintiffs, including environmentalists, civil servants, artists, business people, and others, filed a civil lawsuit against the government for ignoring air pollution and its impact on their health. The lawsuit particularly targeted the country's president and its ministers of health, Home Affairs, and the environment, because these institutions had enough knowledge to have foreseen the consequences. The accompanying principle, the precautionary principle, is the carrot that accompanies the stick. This can be used to encourage policymakers to make discretionary decisions in situations where their lack of a particular course of action or making a certain decision can result in irreparable harm to society. As I said before, you have to know what you're up against. Foreseeability and the precautionary principle imply that there is a social responsibility to protect Caribbean agriculture from exposure to harm, which scientific investigation has found to be a plausible risk. This is the essence of the strategy in which, in the long run, all take win as against winners taking all. My final words were that I am still looking forward to you guys showing us how your research will increase the options that are available to our farming population. For when our farmers have viable options, they can craft effective coping strategies and shift their approach until they hit the mark. Help me make small farming in the Caribbean options rich. Frankly speaking, I had it with this conference and already had plans of skipping out after my speech and visiting my friend and ACT colleague, Dr. Vincent Richards, who was living in Antigua at that time. I only stuck around because they had me as the last speaker, and that is the burden of all last speakers, to hear everything that goes before. However, my good friend Steve Maxime, the facilitator, sabotaged my chances of an early getaway, as he kept encouraging the working sessions to come up with ideas to make Caribbean agriculture options rich. As the options rich guy, I could not just disappear from the scene of the crime just like that. Picking tour of Cardi offices. One very important thing happened at the end of the Caribbean Agricultural Week. The CTA office was so impressed with the synthesis study that they immediately approved a budget for Cardi to fund a lecture series for me to visit the Cardi offices in other islands. Poor Norman Gibson was frantically on the phone trying to get this new show on the road. One thing must be clear. I was not being asked to do a speaking tour because I was an established scientist. It was because I could effectively position agro-biodiversity within the structure of farm enterprises in the Caribbean. Eventually, Gibson was able to organize 2 visiting sessions, one with Cardi in St. Kitts and the other one with Cardi in Belize. Both sessions were well received, but I had an even greater reception in Belmopan when the attendees discovered that I had written the Belize EU country support strategy back in 2008 and was very well informed on the Belizean economic situation. The results of this synthesis study work was published in the Net Journals of Agriculture Science in March 2020 under the caption, How Agro-Biodiversity Conservation Can Rebuild CARICOM Small Farming Systems.